Well, good afternoon, everyone. We're really delighted that you could join us today for one in a string of events that helps us commemorate the Center for Disabilities Studies' 25th anniversary. This morning, we had an amazing panel presentation. I'm noting that some of you in the audience were able to join us this morning as well, and I'm hearing lots and lots of buzz about that presentation. We are very fortunate that one of our panelists is also going to be giving a talk to us now, and that will be followed by a reception out here in the lobby immediately after the conclusion of the talk. So you have a lot more information about Dr. Rabia Belt in your materials, so I encourage you to take a look at that for a more extensive bio, but I will just tell you that she comes to us from Stanford Law School, where she is a legal historian and an assistant professor, and she has a most erudite and passionate take on the role of voting as a prime means of civic engagement for people with disabilities and other marginalized folks. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Rabia Belt.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me here. This is the first time that I've stopped in Delaware. I've driven through it before, sort of multiple times. I'm from New Jersey, and I also have lived in DC. But having a chance to celebrate with you, with your Center for Disability Studies, your absolutely gorgeous campus, such a beautiful campus, is a real privilege. I want to thank Victor Schaffner, Beth Minio, Amy Lane, and other coordinators from the Center for Disability Studies for being here, all of you in the audience, much appreciated, and my fellow panelists from this morning for being here as well. I wanted to leave time at the end of this conversation to make sure that we have time for discussion, because I know that many of you in the audience have a lot of expertise and experience, so we can have a good conversation. And hopefully someone can let me know how I can put the PowerPoint presentation on, because it's not on right now. Excellent, okay, fantastic. I'm in the humanities, so I'm on that side of the campus of Stanford, not on the tech side. So the first slide says, Contemporary Voting Rights Controversies Through the Lens of Disability. So the summary for this talk on your pamphlet said that people with disabilities are the ticking time bomb of the electorate, which sounds a little bit ominous, but it is something that is a very important part of our democracy that we don't talk about enough. So an estimated 30 to 35% of all voters in the next 25 years will need some type of accommodation, and every person in the United States is vulnerable falling into this category, and nearly 1 in 5 of us will before we die. And despite the significant and growing population of voters with disabilities, we don't vote in proportion with our numbers. So surveys indicate that potential voters with disabilities are up to 21 percentage points less likely to vote than potential voters without disabilities. So we're missing about 3 million voters with disabilities because of this participation gap. So we can consider voters with disabilities as not just the ticking time bomb, but also the metaphorical canaries in the coal mine, the people who are an advance warning of structural difficulties in voting, not just for themselves, but also for the system as a whole. So are there any students here that are here for a class? Do you have to write a paper for it? All right, so write this part down. So, so I argue that solving problems for voting for people with disabilities will strengthen the entire system and help improve voting, not just for everyone, especially for people from disempowered communities. And furthermore, although election scholars have largely ignored the unique voting problems confronting voters with disabilities, virtually every major voting controversy in contemporary American electoral politics directly implicates issues of disability. So when we tend to think about voting and disability, if we think about it at all, we usually think about classic issues such as physical access, but the contemporary problems that preoccupy election lawyers and the public are also heavily implicated by disability. So I'm going to address first these classic issues of voting that are actually flagged as barriers for people with disabilities. And then I'm also going to talk about those voting problems that are not marked as disability problems, but they are disability problems as well. So the next slide says, who are voters with disabilities? And there's a graphic that says 1 in 5 American adults has a disability. This proportion is steadily increasing as the population ages. The elderly population is expected to increase to 70 million by 2030. People over the age of 80 are projected to be the fastest growing segment of the US population. By 2060, nearly 1/3 of elderly voters will be 1/3 of eligible voters will be elderly, and 36% of the elderly population has a disability. And notably, the elderly population is getting browner as well, so 40% of that elderly population will also be of color. So we can use statistics to think about how to measure the disability population. But in disability studies, we have other types of metrics. So instead of just focusing on individual impairments and how they're self-reported, which is what the Census Bureau does, disability studies focuses on the social conditions that give rise to the difficulties that people with impairments have to surmount. So a person in a wheelchair, for example, has a very different life in a world that addresses her needs with curb cuts and elevators rather than one that does not. So the impediments that structure our electoral landscape importantly shape the constituency of the disability community and the barriers that they face as potential political citizens. So for example, we have those elderly people that are reported as people with disabilities that fall under these formal definitions, but we may have other elderly people that have physical impairments such as mobility issues that make it hard for them to travel or walk unaided, so they may not be able to vote if they have to wait in a long line. We have over 1 million potential voters that have a hand or arm impairment that would make it difficult to manipulate a paper ballot without an accommodation or an electronic one. They may not be able to use a touchscreen. Over 10 million potential voters have a visual impairment that would make it difficult to read small print on a ballot. And all of these people may not be captured by these statutory legal definitions of disability, but they have disability problems nonetheless. So the statistic of the 1 in 5 or the 56 million are just the tip of the iceberg, and they capture only the people often have the most severe impairments. So when we look at the voting process, though, we have to also think about the people with lower level impairments who may also have difficulties. We also see that people with disabilities tend to be among the most disempowered of Americans on many different metrics. So they are more likely to be Black or brown, elderly, female, unemployed, and poor. So they have a host of cross-cutting challenges. So when we look at these other communities, we have to make sure that we also address disability. So this slide says typical disability problems and solutions, and it's a map of the United States that's broken up by voting precinct. So one of the big challenges with respect to voting is that election practice in the United States is extremely localized. So in one federal election, there may be over 10,000 election jurisdictions, 1.4 million poll workers, and over 700,000 voting machines. So any particular voter can't anticipate that the problem she'll face at one polling place will be the same as at another. And the anticipation of issues based on prior experience can create a chilling effect for potential voters who may not want to face an inaccessible polling place or hostile poll workers again. So previous problems can create future low participation, even if all the problems are solved in the present day. So it makes it even more crucial to address barriers as quickly as possible. And what are some of these barriers? So one we have here, we have someone who's a wheelchair user who's being assisted out of a van, is transportation. So 30% of people with disabilities don't drive, and for that group, their turnout is 15 to 20% lower than average. People with disabilities are more likely to live alone, which makes it harder to find another person to get a ride. And also, potential voters with disabilities are disproportionately rural, so it can mean a long distance between home and the polling place. We also have polling place barriers themselves. So this is someone who's a wheelchair user that's trying to open a door to access a polling place. So in 2000, the General Accounting Office, is basically the auditor for the United States government, they surveyed 496 polling places in 100 counties in 33 states. No polling places that they surveyed had voting technology for blind voters. 84% of polling places had at least one impediment, including a lack of accessible parking, no curb cuts, and steep ramps. When we get to 2012, things had improved. So 30% of voters with disabilities had difficulty voting. This is an success somewhat. It is an improvement. By contrast, only 8% of people without disabilities face challenges. 40% of people with disabilities had not voted in a polling place in the previous 10 years. And they said they expected to encounter difficulties if they tried to vote, as opposed to 1% of a comparable group of people without disabilities. And we have poll workers. This is a picture of a poll worker that is assisting, hopefully, someone with a visual impairment. So voters in 2012 related multiple anecdotes on how poll workers impeded their ability to vote. An Arizona worker reported that when she asked to use the accessible voting equipment, she was told no, she didn't need it. Poll workers told another Arizona voter that they didn't know how to use the accessible equipment, and thus she wouldn't be able to vote. A poll worker in Illinois told a voter that she could not have an assistant help her to vote because she did not look like she had a disability. In Michigan, a nonverbal voter with a physical disability was questioned as to his right to vote by poll workers. And surveys of Missouri and Tennessee voters with disabilities concluded that the major problems that they had were lack of knowledge by poll workers about accommodations or disabilities, and discomfort by poll workers to help people use accessible technology. So those are the things that people who are disability advocates usually flag as the typical problems that voters with disabilities or potential voters with disability face. But then we also have these contemporary voting controversies that the public talks about, and election law scholars talk about, and maybe you guys talk about. They spill over the pages of newspaper articles, blogs, court opinions, whatever you guys, the youth talk through, I don't know, Instagram or something, Twitter. Well, advocates and scholars that talk about elections, they've recognized the effect of these voting controversies With respect to their disparate impact on voters of color, less attention has been paid to how disability is implicated in these key disputes and how these two things intersect. So voters with disabilities are implicated in voter fraud. They're disparately impacted by voter identification requirements. Long lines deter them from voting. They disproportionately vote absentee. Their problems with new voting technology affect the design of all of these machines at their foundation. So we can't solve all of these problems that everyone is talking about without attention to the issues that voters with disabilities face. So the first one is voter fraud, which is actually a non-existent problem. So despite allegations of widespread voter fraud, studies, people who actually study this, have not found it to be a widespread phenomenon. So for example, one study found that there were 31 cases of voter fraud out of over 1 billion, billion with a B, votes cast between 2000 and 2014. However, there's a lot of conversation about voter fraud, and voter fraud was one of the animating elements for the Supreme Court in upholding the strict Indiana voter identification rules in a case, Crawford versus Marion County Election Board, and after that, a series of states passed stricter voter identification laws. Ironically, though, when voter fraud actually or potentially occurs, it's in areas where people with disabilities predominate, such as absentee voting in long-term care facilities. And one thing that the discussion of voter fraud does is push more people into the absentee voting system, which sees more problematic voting happen. So long-term care facilities are a particular concern in addressing the problems of voters with disabilities. About 1.4 million people live in nursing homes, and this doesn't even include the people who live in other institutions such as assisted living facilities, retirement communities, and rest homes, and we don't even have a good number on that, how many people live in these places. And despite the absence of widespread voter fraud, remember, so write that down too, there is no widespread voter fraud. Allegations of fraud have occurred with elderly and disabled residents. So political groups may employ what's called granny farming, where people with disabilities and the elderly are signed up to vote with pre-marked ballots without their consent. And people in long-term care facilities may suffer from voter fraud due to interference by third parties. So administrators may act as gatekeepers, and they may restrict the ballot from people who live within the facilities. There's a minority of states that include within their absentee balloting procedures specific provisions for these residents. But many facilities are not actually aware that they can request voting assistance from election officials for their residents. And the residents want to vote like everyone else. So we are discussing a non-existing voting fraud problem and minimizing or ignoring like the actual voting irregularities that are happening among voters with disabilities. Another issue is voter ID. So this is a sign that says must show ID to vote. The League of Women Voters estimates that nearly 10% of voters with disabilities do not have photo ID, and 6 million people over the age of 65 lack a photo ID, which is often and increasingly becoming required to vote in this country. And when people with disabilities they often have Social Security or Medicaid cards, these pieces of identification are not sufficient under many of the new laws. And rural voters, remember again, they're disproportionately voters with disabilities, face difficulties obtaining voter identification from often remote government offices. And poor people, who are also disproportionately people with disabilities, are less likely to have identification. People who are homeless are affected by residency requirements, especially if you have to prove residency far in advance. If you live with a caretaker, it may be difficult to have documentation with your own name and address. So a utility bill, for example, may not be in your own name. And taking advantage of disability exemptions for identification requires knowledge by either the person with a disability or some type of state employee on what type of information is needed for these requirements. And they may not be able to drive to a driver's license facility, or public transportation may be absent or inaccessible. So this is a group that is particularly hit by these more stringent voter ID requirements, which are, again, requirements that are being mandated to solve the problem of voter fraud, which, remember, does not exist. So, long lines. This is a photo of people that are waiting to vote. President Obama famously decried long lines for voting during his victory speech. After the election, he said, quote, "I want to thank every American who participated in this election, whether you voted for the very first time or waited in line for a very long time. We have to fix that." So long lines are the culmination of a lack of resources, such as poll workers and voting machines, allocated to particular voting sites. More than 5 million voters waited more than an hour to vote in 2012. And an estimated 500,000 to 730,000 votes were lost due to long lines in 2012. People just gave up and they went home. So when the press and scholars have discussed long lines, they usually focus on race, and they highlight that people of color disproportionately face long lines to vote, which is incredibly true. Disability is also implicated in these long lines, though, as some racial minorities are disproportionately more disabled than white Americans. And also, people with disabilities often require more time at the polling place itself because of the need for accommodation. So what long lines do is they add to the time tax that scholars identify for voting that disproportionately falls upon people with disabilities. And long lines may not just be an inconvenience, they may make voting an impossibility for some people with impairments such as physical frailty, old age, post-traumatic stress disorder, or traumatic brain injuries. So they may be able to find it intolerable to wait in a long line. And this may hurt disabled veterans disproportionately. And many of these impairments are invisible to poll workers. So they may not be able to identify the voters in long lines that are in need of assistance. And because of poor training, they may not know what accommodations that they can employ to help people with disabilities. And then also the voters who are in the long lines, they may not know that they can ask for these accommodations, either because there's no signage or they haven't received any type of information in advance. Finally, absentee ballots. This is a person's hand holding up an absentee ballot envelope. So people with disabilities are far more likely to vote absentee than people without disabilities. It's about 40% of voters with disabilities use absentee ballots. And in general, the use of absentee ballots is on the increase. And states vary pretty considerably in terms of the hoops that they require you to jump through before allowing you to have an absentee ballot. The thing is, though, that voting by mail is not a panacea to all of these problems. So there are examples of absentee ballot manipulation, such as caretakers, loved ones, completing people's ballots without their consent or participation, marking the ballots of people contrary to their wishes, and then going back to long-term care facilities, supervisors and administrators there, marking everyone's ballots in a particular way. And states may have procedures that make it difficult or impossible for people with disabilities to vote absentee. So, for instance, the absentee ballot itself may not have accommodations, so it may be paper, it may not be in Braille, so people can't mark it by hand without assistance. So Maryland, for instance, had an online ballot marking tool, but they only made it available to people in the military overseas. So people who were in Maryland that had a disability weren't able to access it. And sometimes they require people to complete the application in writing, such as in Ohio. But if you can't write, then using a pen, then you can't get an absentee ballot. And then also people who are in long-term care facilities can have difficulties because they may have moved out of their previous electoral district to go into the facility. So that means they may have to register again. And it could be really hard for people in those facilities to have a secret and independent vote. And absentee voters in general can't take advantage of late-breaking news or information about the election. They can't participate in the widespread civic ritual of voting in public. If you make a mistake in voting, that's it. You can't fix it. And also that absentee voting is used as a way, sort of a get-out-of-jail-free card tool, often for states, that they don't fix the requirements that are happening within in-person voting. They'll just tell people with disabilities to use absentee voting, and that way it actually makes it a method of second-class voting. And we have veterans. So this is a group of veterans at a VA hospital with different types of impairments. So we valorize our veterans in this country, sort of. So there are robust protections in place for the right to vote for active duty service members and people who have to vote absentee. These all disappear and dry up once service members are discharged and become veterans. So an estimated 2.9 million Americans are veterans with disabilities. Over 180,000 Iraq and Afghanistan veterans collect disability benefits, and that number is growing. And psychological injuries include, as I said, PTSD and traumatic brain injury, which can increase the cognitive challenges of voting. It may be difficult for these voters to keep track of a complicated voting process, concentrate, use novel voting technology, be in a long line, be in a crowded facility. And compounding this is that their injuries are not always visible, and often their impairments are fairly recently acquired. So they're not necessarily used to using assistive technologies or asking for disability accommodations. And they're often receiving medical care away from their residencies, and they have to vote absentee, or they aren't necessarily sort of with their families. And then one of the things that everyone is very worried about right now, voting technology. So this is a picture of a man that's using an electronic voting machine. So the main purpose of the Help America Vote Act, which was passed after Bush v. Gore, was to update election technology for voting from paper ballots to an electronic system. And it requires that there has to be at least one accessible voting machine in each polling place. The thing is, though, that there are many different demands of accessible voting, so from people who have trouble with dexterity, to people who are blind, to elderly voters who have trouble with new electronic technology. And then there's also a big tension between those who emphasize accessibility and those who prize technological security. So the accessibility camp would prefer that people use their own technology to access voting, because that would be both more comfortable for the voters and to encompass a lot of different types of disabilities. On the other hand, the system without centralized control would introduce a number of technological headaches, such as the possibility of computer vulnerabilities and hacking. So disability advocates have praised the possibility of voting technology to make voting more accessible than paper and allow a secret and independent vote for the first time for some voters. But people have also criticized current technology for its unwieldiness and lack of user-friendliness. And often people with disabilities are left out of the testing process to begin with, so they can't weigh in on these accessibility features at the beginning, so we can bake them in sort of at the outset, and instead things get fixed or not fixed at the polling place itself. So right now there's no silver bullet machine that's wholly accessible, comfortable for both voters and poll workers, and technologically secure. So the jury is still out on this one. And then one thing that I work on in particular, voters with mental disabilities, which is something that the public doesn't talk about, and often disability advocates don't talk about it either. So this is a map of the United States. The states in blue are the states that disenfranchise people based on their mental status. The states in turquoise here are states that have not updated their language from the 1800s when they put these disenfranchising provisions in the first place. So they still disenfranchise either idiots and lunatics or idiots and insane people. Only the states that are in white are the ones that do not have any disenfranchising provisions for people based on mental status. So the requirements for these vary. Sometimes it's based on status. If you are someone who is considered to be mentally incompetent, you cannot vote. Sometimes it's based on whether a judge has decreed you as mentally incompetent. Sometimes it's based on whether or not you are under guardianship. But it is quite arbitrarily enforced, and it can be enforced upon people that don't even have mental disabilities at the polling places. So there's many people, for instance, who have cerebral palsy, who have severe MS, often things where their bodies are moving in a particular way that the poll workers believe that this indicates some type of mental incompetency, even if the disability itself has no type of mental impairment associated with it. So, what do we do about all of this? So I'm a law professor, so first thing I do is look at the law. There are several statutes that currently address voting for people with disabilities, either expressly or implicitly. Unfortunately, though, these statutes are not really designed to address voting and disability together because of vagueness, under-inclusiveness, and absence of minimal federal statutes, standards, and a lack of protection for a secret and independent vote. These include the Voting Rights Act, which does allow that voters with disabilities should receive accommodation, and only lists blindness as a disability, for example, does not say anything about voting privately and independent and polling place accessibility, and it only applies to federal elections. We also have the Voting Accessibility for the Elderly and Handicapped Act, which was put in place in 1984. Again, you have to say what the problems are 45 days in advance of the election. So as you can imagine, this is not a statute that gets used very often because you don't know what the problems are that far in advance. And you also can't receive any type of damages. The only thing that really happens is if you do say through using the act through a court that there's something wrong, the court will say to the state or locality, stop doing that. But the lawyer who brings that lawsuit is not going to get paid for this. And we have the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is the most overarching of disability protection. But the legacy of the ADA with respect to voting protection is mixed. Not all polling places are covered. For example, if they're in private places, courts have not required that all polling places be deemed accessible or guaranteed a secret and independent ballot. And also, localities can plead undue financial or administrative hardship as a way to get out of having these mandated accessibilities. The latest one is the Help America Vote Act of 2002, which I said was enacted after Bush v. Gore. Scholars call it, in terms of the Help America Vote Act, that it did not Its focus was on updating voting machines. That money has run out at this point. It does say that voters with disabilities, like everyone else, should have a secret and independent vote, but like previous statutes, it only discusses blind and visually impaired voters. It doesn't talk about any other type of disability, does not provide any technical guidelines, minimum national standards, so it's still a patchwork. And it's silent on absentee voting, which is where most voters with disabilities vote these days. When it comes to policy, scholars and advocates have produced all sorts of data about voting. But very little of it actually addresses voters with disabilities. And it's really hard to obtain access for voting information for people with disabilities on state websites. Again, one of the big problems is the locally driven aspect of voting, which makes it hard for advocacy groups or anyone else to determine what's going on. So what this leaves is you guys. So we have two things that we have to do. One is that we have to foreground the issues that confront voters with disabilities, to talk about the things that were in the first part of this speech. The second thing we have to do is to really emphasize the disability aspect of the conversation that's already happening with respect to voting. We're coming up on a midterm election. We are going to have a very pivotal presidential election. People are worried about voting. They're worried about whether or not machines are going to be hacked. They're worried if they're going to stand in the line for hours on end. They're worried if their vote is going to count. People with disabilities are worried about all of these things and more, and it's up to us to bring these issues to attention so that we can finally have the democracy that we need and deserve. So, thank you. So questions, comments, thoughts? And there are mics down here. Ooh, there's a hand right there.
Hi, sorry, you mentioned four laws. May you repeat what the second law was?
What the second law was?
The first was Voting Rights Act.
There was the Voting Rights Act. You mean the Voting Accessibility for the Elderly and Handicapped Act?
What was the first word?
Voting Accessibility for the Elderly and Handicapped Act of 1984.
Thank you.
You're welcome. That was an easy one to answer.
Hi. Delaware had a bill proposed last year that would have expanded, well, not expanded, created early in-person voting in Delaware, which is something that we do not have right now. Could you just talk a little bit about what effect that will have on voters with disabilities?
So it seems like that would be great because it would allow people, especially people who have transportation issues, more options to access polling places besides the day of the election, when folks who are doing get out the vote campaigns are going to be saturated. So on that respect, it's good. To allow people more time for voting is great. On the other hand, though, like absentee voting, it could have a negative edge to it if it's used as a way to de-emphasize the importance of the election day itself for folks that want to be part of that civic ritual. Did it go anywhere? Did it pass?
Oh, I'm sorry, no, it did not pass.
Oh. Yeah, that's one thing that's happening now, unfortunately, is that the time that people have both to register and then also to vote is being reduced. So before we used to see that people would be able to vote, say, over the course of a week or two, or perhaps register over the course of a week or two, but that time is shrinking.
How do you feel about the Oregon mail-in ballot system?
Yes, Oregon's an interesting state because it's entirely mail-in. So it reduces the issue in terms of the second-class voting. So people with disabilities who mail in their votes are going to be the same as everyone else who mails in their votes. There's some problems with mail-in voting that I flagged before in terms of, say, caretakers and loved ones who are marking ballots for other people that are still a problem. But the thing is, though, Oregon has to deal with how to get ballots to everyone. So they've solved some problems that other states are still grappling with. So they're really good at, for instance, bringing ballots to people that live in facilities instead of requiring people in facilities to go to the polling places. For example, they've thought about different types of accessibility methods for different types of ballots so that people don't necessarily have to have a ballot that's printed in ink. They could have something that's in Braille. And also their website, their state website for information on how to get a mail-in ballot is pretty good. So it's a state that we can look to for the future, perhaps, for what other people can do.
Is there any polling information on the partisan split amongst people with disabilities? Because cynically, that seems like it would go a long way to say if any group would pick up the issues as to correct them. Right.
So there's a couple things that go into the partisan aspect of this. And one thing that I should say at the outset is that, so I'm a member of the Council for the National Council on Disability, which is the federal agency that advises the President and Congress and other federal agencies on disability. I am not speaking for them right now. I am speaking just as a private citizen. So voters with disabilities can get caught up in the collateral consequences of partisanship. So if a political party, usually the Republican Party, that is targeting another group, say poor people or people of color, does things such as make stricter voter ID laws, the intent is not to disenfranchise voters with disabilities. They just get caught up into it. When we survey potential voters with disabilities, they don't necessarily track Democratic or Republican, so they're on both sides. But it depends on what subsection of the population we're talking about. So if we're thinking about people who are older, especially much older, then that's going to be a group within sort of voters with disabilities that are whiter and more conservative. If we're looking at people who are younger, they're going to be browner and poorer and trend Democratic. So it sort of depends on where you are in the country and sort of what part it is, but they're up for grabs as a group from any party that sort of wishes to sort of gain more votes if they pay more attention to the issues that are for voters with disabilities.
First, I want to say thank you for coming.
You're welcome.
And I could probably stand here for another hour and ask you a bunch of questions, but these people got lives to get to.
Right.
So if you'll indulge me with just two. The first one was you mentioned 2.9 disabled vets and the problems, whether it's retirement, long-term facilities, and the VA hospital. And then you mentioned the state of Maryland's problem with overseas vets being able to vote and then them not being able to. Is there anything in the works that will allow that to be more fluid for both those overseas as well as our veterans within the VA? And then the second question is there any state or locale that's doing it right, that is, championing disability rights that we can kind of look to? Thank you.
So to clarify, it's the issue with Maryland was that it was overseas soldiers, not overseas veterans. So the landscape is very different for soldiers, active duty soldiers, than it is for veterans. There was a push towards the end of the Obama administration to get more voter registration and voting for people that were in VA hospitals. That has not really continued. So I don't know what's going on right now in terms of sort of the push for that to happen. I guess we'll see with the midterm elections to see what happens, because that is something that's certainly an issue. There's been more visibility in terms of funding for VA hospitals, but does that mean that the people who are in the hospitals themselves are disenfranchised? Doesn't seem so great for the people that are fighting for this country and got wounded. So in terms of states that are doing best practices, there are some states that are better than others. So as I mentioned before, Oregon's been doing a lot of innovation with respect to mail-in ballots. Wisconsin has also been doing a lot of interesting things. So they did an audit of all of their polling places, and then they worked to fix any type of lack of accommodations. And one of the things that they realized is that with many polling places, they are public locations, so they're covered under the ADA anyway, so they can kill two birds with one stone. So if you add curb cuts to a school or a government building, then people are going to need that all of the time, and then that's also going to help voting turnout, because if you go there to the school, you realize that this is someplace that you can access on just a day-to-day basis, it's going to make it more likely for you to come back to vote. They also do more work in terms of, as I said before, like the shifting the burden. So bringing election officials to long-term care facilities, as opposed to requiring those people to either vote absentee without any type of supervision except for administrators at the long-term care facilities, which has its own problems, or to try to leave the facility and go to a polling place. And then they've also done a lot of work. All of this stuff has been done in conversation with the disability community. So that's been one of the key things in terms of identifying the issues that Wisconsin voters with disabilities had and actually addressing them.
Thank you for coming out, to echo the other commenter.
You're welcome. And I got Cracker Jacks, too. So.
I have just a quick comment before my question. To touch on the question about partisanship, the Pew Research Center did a breakdown just after the 2016 election and found that people with disabilities and people without almost exactly mirror each other.
Right.
The partisan breakdown, 50% identified as Democrat or lean Democrat, 42% as Republican or lean Republican.
Right.
But my question was, when we say we have to foreground these issues, what practically does that mean? We need to talk to media, we need to talk to politicians outside the disability community. Most of the folks in this room already pretty much agree. So in your work as a historian, have you found any specific strategies that have been particularly effective?
It's a good question. So I have a history hat, and I also have a policy hat. And the history hat, in some ways, is easier because everyone is dead, and they don't talk back. So one thing is that's important is joining forces. So disability is a big tent, and some parts of the tent get more attention than others. So that's part of why I think we still have that map that I showed you before with respect to mental disability. So if you are someone who is part of a sub-community that does receive a lot of attention or more attention, then it's important to bring everyone else with you. So if you are having a meeting with election officials and they just want to talk about things like curb cuts, then you have to say that that's really important for people that are wheelchair users or have some types of physical disabilities, but what are they doing for voters with mental disabilities? Another thing is that when we have conversations about disability, it can't just be on the issue of aesthetics or culture and emotion. We also have to think about policy and politics. So for instance, with Donald Trump, who made fun of the reporter You guys remember that before? So often when you look at the newspaper articles for that, it'll just be Donald Trump mocks disabled reporter. But that person has a name. His name is Serge Kowalewski. He has a Pulitzer Prize in journalism. And it's not just about mocking someone and we feel outraged about it because it seems like bullying. We should be worried because there are all of these other types of policies that accompany stigmatizing people with disabilities. So when we're thinking about, say, the Affordable Care Act going away, or if we're worried about pre-existing conditions, those are things that hurt the disability community, and they need to also be foregrounded. So there's stuff like that that we need to talk about. And then for people who are within sort of more traditional civil rights or voting organizations, they also need to think about disability too. So if we're thinking about, say that there are voting practices that are targeting communities of color, recognize that a big part of those communities of color are people of color with disabilities. So we all have to come together along with this. I don't have the mic, so.
Hi.
Yeah, hi.
Thanks for coming. I have two very quick questions. The first is, I was wondering whether there's been any movement lately in state legislatures to update mental health adjudication laws that restrict the rights of people with psychosocial disabilities to vote. My second question, and I'm sorry if you already addressed this earlier, is whether there are mechanisms for people who are temporarily incapacitated and prevented from voting, either as a result of a car accident or a psychotic episode or what have you, in order to have like proxy voters or some other surrogate make sure that they get to vote.
Great. So I haven't heard about anything recently in terms of legislators pushing to enfranchise people based on mental status. It is a very hard hill to climb. So legislators don't want to necessarily be associated with enfranchising people based on mental status, because you can imagine what the newspaper articles look like, right? Especially if you're in a state that uses that old language, that it's like legislators pushing for the voting rights of insane people. The same thing sort of hits voter referendums too, that push for enfranchisement. They're not very successful. So what has been successful is litigation, but it's hard to get that litigation going. So the states that are the ones that are white, the reason why those happened is because they had guardianship statutes, so that people lost the right to vote because of guardianship. So essentially what happened was legally that was deemed to be vague and overbroad. So people expected to, say, get financial help if they wanted a guardian. They didn't expect to lose the right to vote. The problem is, though, that many of the other states that are still colored are states that disenfranchise based on status. So they disenfranchise because you are considered to be mentally incompetent. One of the ironies of the voting revolution that happened in the 60s and 70s, as we were trying to enfranchise Black Americans and get rid of things such as literacy tests, is that the Supreme Court had language that said that states had a right in preserving an intelligent electorate. And that language has been read very broadly to still protect against election challenges for things like this. So it will take some type of legislative override, some type of popular sort of referendum to get that going. So it's going to be hard for that to happen. In terms of people that are temporarily incapacitated, it's a great question. One of the things that I'm working on now is to look at people who are within institutional settings, and that includes, say, if you're in the hospital the week of an election, what do? So you may not have had time to get an absentee ballot, you can't leave to go to a polling place, what happens? If you do have some sort of temporary mental condition, if you have some sort of psychotic break for a while, what does that mean in terms of your voting status? It's something that we need to capture more, and because we have this hodgepodge of voting restrictions that are getting even tighter, it makes it hard to address that in a systematic way.
As a very quick follow-up,
Yeah.
has anyone that, as far as you're aware, has anyone spoken about connecting those to advanced directives in order to, as a mechanism for having
Connecting it to what, sorry?
advanced directives?
Advanced directives. Oh, so there's someone who is Alex Bonney-Sands, S-A-E-N-Z, who's at Chicago Kent, who does elder law, who has been talking about third-party voting, so proxy voting. So if you have, for instance, dementia, assigning your vote to someone in advance. I am a bit concerned about that in terms of whether or not that would have a sort of people sort of ripe for abuse, the abuse that we already see happening with people that are in places like nursing homes, especially if you are someone you don't necessarily, you can't really assign your vote in advance. Like what happens to the person that you think you're going to vote for and they do something? You may not want to vote for them anymore, and you can't lock it in. Like, that's not how we expect voting to happen. But he's been talking about that, and it would be a good person to sort of look up to explore it.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm from the Hearing Loss Association of Delaware, and the question that I have is we have had consumers report to us that have hearing loss. And what happens is one of them went into the polling area. They were calling out their name and they couldn't hear it. And then the other issue was when they went into the voting booth and the curtain closed behind them, there was a malfunction in the machine. And as a result, the voting person, or the assistant on the outside, was trying to tell them how about the malfunction and what to do, and they couldn't hear what they said. Mm-hmm. And so they ended up pulling the curtain, which invalidated some of their votes, mm-hmm. and then their vote was counted, whatever they had voted for, but then they couldn't vote anymore. So that's the second issue. And the third issue just came up recently when a person with older person that had both hearing and vision, dual sensory problem, said that they did not feel that they could vote anymore because of the hearing and vision and seeing the ballot. So these are just some issues that are coming up with the folks here in Delaware.
Yeah. I'm sorry to hear all of that, and I am also sorry that those are not rare occurrences. So I hope that your group can connect with the Secretary of State of Delaware to help remedy these things, at least locally, and keep on talking about this, because we need to really foreground these problems, which are happening way too often all over the place, not just Delaware.
Hi, actually a comment. Every state has what's called a protection and advocacy system for persons with disabilities, which is an agency specifically designated to protect and advocate for the rights of persons with disabilities. And the sorts of complaints that we just heard about are exactly the sort of thing that those agencies need to know about. In Delaware, it's the Disabilities Law Program, which is part of Community Legal Aid Society. And they do, we do poll monitoring for ADA compliance. We've been doing it since 2004. We get volunteers. We spread out across the state. We're always looking for volunteers. But even then, if we don't hear about things, if something doesn't happen right when we're there, and so no matter what state you're in, there's an agency that gets federal dollars just to, or in part, to do this stuff to protect voters' rights. And so I certainly encourage you, whatever state you're from, if you're aware of these kinds of problems, to please report them to the P&A system.
Thank you. You two should talk later.
Hello. I just had a question about at what point does a person's mental capability prevent them from voting? Because it seems like it's a really gray area and very subjective.
Yes, that's exactly the case. It's so frustrating. So if you are just the average American voter, then you do not have to explain the reason why you voted for anyone to anyone. So, and I think we have an idea that people have a considered sense of their voting, that they do a lot of research and they weigh everything. No, no, no. People vote for the first person on the ballot. They vote for a tall guy with hair. There's all sorts of things that go into how people actually vote that are not particularly considered. I think one thing that's happening is that we're a little anxious about that, right? We want voting to be a really respectable endeavor, and it often isn't. So I think that's one of the reasons why we had a mental status floor for voting. We're saying that people need to sort of go above some type of mental status threshold in order to vote, to make sure that voting is honorable or respectable, so that the people can vote for the first tall guy with hair that they see on the ballot. So when it comes, though, to assessing whether or not you've jumped that threshold, yes, exactly. It is entirely a gray area, totally arbitrary, and subject to someone's stereotype judgment on whether or not you have crossed that threshold, which is, in my opinion, pretty wrong that we do that, and seems like on its face would be pretty discriminatory. I'm glad I brought the Cracker Jacks in. So it's in my gift bag. I was very excited. Thank you, Delaware. You guys are very great.
Thank you, Rabia. I know that other people had questions because I saw hands going up and down and up and down, and Rabia will be with us during the reception, so you will have an opportunity to speak with her. So I do invite all of you to join us for the reception immediately outside. And once again, please join me in thanking Rabia Bell. Thank you so much.